Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting. My name is Milan Rai. I'm the editor of Peace News, and tonight's meeting is called Even Churchill Thought Hiroshima Was Unnecessary. And now we're going to see if I know how to use the technology to share the screen. Okay. So in a 2002 BBC poll, Churchill was named the greatest Briton of all time. And in a YouGov poll in 2018, he was picked by British adults as their most respected leader of the 20th century. Gandhi came in 7th in that list. So Churchill is an enormously respected person in Britain and across much of the world. What this talk is about the gap between what Churchill said publicly for much of his life and what he said privately about the ending of the Pacific War. And there was a huge contradiction between those two things. So this is a picture of Churchill campaigning in the 1945 general election. After the atomic bombings, Churchill said in a speech to the House of Commons on the 16th of August, 1945, about Hiroshima, "I am surprised that very worthy people, but people who in most cases had no intention of proceeding to the Japanese front themselves, should adopt the position that rather than throw this bomb, we should have sacrificed 1 million American and 250,000 British lives in the desperate battles and massacres of an invasion of Japan." And at that time, July, August 1945, the estimate of the British and US military was that it would take a year to probably a year and a half to militarily conquer Japan. So what Churchill said in public was the only alternatives were either to carry out that long, bloody campaign, costing over 1 million Allied lives and a large number of lives of Asians as well, or to drop these atomic bombs. However, before the 16th of August, in fact, quite a bit before that date, Churchill had been saying in private something completely different. He had been not only coming to a different view, but he had been putting it to US leaders. This is him talking to President Roosevelt, who led the United States through most of the Second World War. This is him talking to President Truman. And he put two other options that he believed could have ended the Pacific War to both of these presidents. And that is the subject of this talk tonight. So one of those options was a Soviet declaration of war on Japan. And this is a picture of Stalin, the Soviet leader, at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945 in Berlin, in conquered Germany, where the crucial decisions were actually made leading up to the atomic bombings. So one option, which Churchill believed might have been able to gain a Japanese surrender, was a Russian declaration of war against Japan. Obviously, the Soviet Union was one of the allies fighting the Second World War for most of the Second World War. But while the Soviet Union was still on the Nazi side, it had agreed a neutrality pact, a non-aggression pact with Japan in April 1941, which was for 5 years. So during Japan's part of the Second World War, which starts at the end of 1941, there was no fighting between the Soviet Union and Japan. And from the Soviet point of view, this meant that they could concentrate their military forces on what was their Western front, and not have to fight a two-front war. And while Japan kind of had some wobbles about it and wondered about attacking the Soviet Union, in the end, they decided to attack the European colonies as their main target and continue to abide by the Neutrality Pact. So in April 1945, the Soviet Union denounced the Neutrality Pact, and the Japanese weren't quite sure what that meant. So they pressed the Soviets to explain, because technically speaking, all that meant was that the Soviets were saying, we're not going to renew this when it runs out in April 1946. So but the way they denounced it, it sounded like they were going to launch a war sooner than that. So the Japanese asked them, are you going to stay in this pact until April 1946? And the Soviets said that they would. However, that was a lie, because they'd made a totally different promise to the US and Britain much earlier. But anyway, that was one card that Churchill thought could play a big role in getting a Japanese surrender. And if you look at this map of Japan's position in August 1940, beginning of August 1945, you can see the brown bits are Japanese controlled territory. So you can see Japan itself, and you can see that the Soviet Union is right there next to Japan, the purple area at the top. You can see Japanese occupied Manchuria, part of China. And then you can see Southeast Asia, and then down below what we would call Indonesia now. And earlier on, Japan had also conquered the Philippines, which the US had retaken, which is why it's green in this picture in mid-1945. And they'd conquered more going out to the Solomon Islands, but they'd been pushed back. So you can see that just from a military point of view, the Soviet Union entering the war creates a giant headache, because Japan is already fighting in many directions, and to also fight from an attack from the north is a militarily huge problem. But the Russian declaration of war was seen as a psychological blow by this point, because Japan, in fact, sort of saw the Soviet Union as a potential ally or intermediary in negotiating a non-disastrous end to the war, and that they had been approaching the Soviet Union to use its good offices with the US and Britain. So that was, this Russian card was one that Churchill believed could secure a Japanese surrender. And so this that is actually a picture of Churchill meeting Roosevelt at the Second Quebec Conference in September 1944. And what Churchill said at that conference was that Stalin had promised in November 1943 that he would declare war on Japan after the Germans were defeated. And in Quebec, Churchill told Roosevelt he was sure the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan. And in his memoirs, Churchill's memoirs, he says that he told Roosevelt, when Japan was confronted with the three most powerful nations in the world, she would undoubtedly think twice about continuing the fight. A few days after that conversation, Churchill sent a cable to Stalin in which he said, I most earnestly desire, and so I know does the president, the intervention of the Soviets in the Japanese war as promised by you at Tehran, which is the November 1943 conference, at Tehran as soon as the German army was beaten and destroyed. The opening of a Russian military front against the Japanese would force them to burn and bleed, especially in the air, in a manner which would vastly accelerate their defeat. From all I have learned about the internal state of Japan and the sense of hopelessness weighing on their people, I believe it might well be that once the Nazis are shattered, a triple summons to Japan to surrender, coming from our three great powers, might be decisive. So this is September 1944. Churchill is already thinking the Russian card, once the Nazis are defeated, has a very good chance of securing a Japanese surrender. In February 1945, there's a meeting in Yalta of the war leaders, and Churchill again puts the same arguments to Roosevelt and to the Combined Chiefs of Staff. So that Combined Chiefs of Staff is the US military leadership and the British military leadership in the combined committee running the war effort in a coordinated way as one body. And according to records, Churchill expressed the opinion that it would be of great value if Russia could be persuaded to join the United States, the British Empire, and China, that's nationalist China under Chiang Kai-shek, who were officially like the other part of the Allies, could join them in the issue of a four-power ultimatum calling upon Japan to surrender unconditionally, or else be subjected to the overwhelming weight of all the forces of the four powers. So he's making the same arguments. And when he met President Truman in Potsdam, because Roosevelt had died in April, and Truman, who had been kept in the dark about most things, suddenly became president. When they met in Potsdam, Churchill met Truman for lunch on the 18th of July, and he put arguments to Truman which he had been asked to pass on by the Combined Chiefs of Staff, by the US and British military leaderships. We don't know exactly what he said, but the chiefs had included a Russian declaration of war in their proposals, which they wanted to Churchill to pass on. And we'll come back to this meeting. So Churchill not only believed that a Soviet declaration of war could win a Japanese surrender, he pushed this option to successive US presidents in successive wartime conferences. The other card that Churchill thought the Allies could play that could get a Japanese surrender all by itself was to promise to spare the Japanese Emperor Hirohito. So Hirohito had led the Japanese war effort. He'd been like the head of the war cabinet officially. So he had been in charge when, the supreme leader of the effort to invade China and take Manchuria, and then to launch war against the Allies, starting with Pearl Harbor. And so he had overseen acts of aggression and many war crimes by the Japanese military forces and occupation forces. And there were many people who thought he should be put on trial for war crimes. And that is what the Japanese thought the Allies intended for him, because the United States had begun demanding unconditional surrender from the Axis powers, including Japan, in January 1943. The next month, Roosevelt said that the demand was for unconditional surrender, and he promised punishment and retribution in full for the guilty barbaric leaders of Germany, Italy, and Japan. So it seemed from that point onwards that the Allies were committed to unconditional surrender, and that would mean Hirohito being forced off the throne, put on trial for war crimes, and possibly executed. And that was something that was unacceptable to the Japanese political and military establishment because of Hirohito's semi-divine status. So in Yalta, Churchill met with Roosevelt and the Combined Chiefs of Staff, as I mentioned earlier, and he put that argument for the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan. And then he went on, according to records of the meeting, Japan might ask in these circumstances what mitigation of the full rigor of unconditional surrender would be extended to her if she accepted the ultimatum. In this event, it would be for the United States to judge the matter, but there was no doubt that some mitigation would be worthwhile if it led to the saving of a year or a year and a half of a war in which so much blood and treasure would be poured out. So what he was saying there was we should spare the emperor, and that would save us this year and a half of war. So we come back to this meeting, lunchtime meeting of Churchill and Truman in Potsdam on the 18th of July. And to fully understand what happened in that meeting, we have to go back a couple of days to a meeting of the combined chiefs of staff. And this isn't actually the combined chiefs of staff meeting in Potsdam. They did meet in Potsdam on the 16th of July. This is a meeting much earlier in Washington, D.C., but it shows you on the left-hand side, British military officials, and on the right-hand side and at the far end, top US military officials, and they're planning the war together. They're conducting the war together. And on the 16th of July, the combined chiefs of staff met and they agreed on the importance of sparing the emperor. So Alan Brooke, who was the head of the British Imperial Forces, the British military forces, he said, from the military point of view, there might be some advantage in trying to explain this term, unconditional surrender, to the Japanese if, for instance, an interpretation could be found and communicated to the Japanese which did not involve the dissolution of the imperial institution, the emperor would be in a position to order the ceasefire in outlying areas, whereas if the dynasty were destroyed, the outlying garrisons might continue to fight for many months or years. So this is the British military leadership saying, we should spare the emperor. And the US side agreed, and they felt that, quote, the correct psychological moment for that clarification of the unconditional surrender terms might be on Russian entry into the war. And the US chief of staff, the US chief, the top military leader on the US side, Admiral Lee, he suggested that because this was a political issue, Churchill should be asked to put forward these views to Truman about how unconditional surrender should be interpreted. So this is a very odd situation where the US military leadership is asking for the British Prime Minister to put views to the US president. This is a sign of their frustration at having made these same arguments alongside civilian officials to the president in other ways and not having made the progress that they felt they deserved. So for them, this was a sort of a desperate last throw of the dice. But anyway, they asked for Churchill to be asked, and he was. And so he met with Truman on the 18th of July. I should say that the US historian Gar Alperovitz, who has written important books on the decision to drop the atomic bomb, which opened my eyes certainly to all of this stuff. Gar Alperovitz points out that the top US military leadership, and actually the British military leadership, as we've just seen, they believe three things about the position of the Japanese emperor at this point. One, Japan was unlikely to surrender if the position of the emperor was under threat. Two, promising to spare the emperor could help to produce a Japanese surrender. And three, without a surrender order from Hirohito, Japanese forces spread across Asia might continue to fight, prolonging the war. And so those were the views of the top military leadership. And as far as we can tell, they were Churchill's views as well. And so he met with Truman, and we don't exactly know what he said, but he wrote later in a private note that he'd told Truman about something Stalin had told him the night before, which was that the Japanese emperor himself had sent out a peace feeler to Stalin asking for him to help negotiate an end to the war. And so Churchill tells Truman this, and he writes, "The president also thought the war might come to a speedy end. I dwelt upon the tremendous cost in American life and to a smaller extent in British life, which would be involved in forcing unconditional surrender upon the Japanese. It was for him to consider whether this might not be expressed in some other way," this like interpreting unconditional surrender in order to spare the emperor. "This might not be expressed in some other way so that we got all the essentials for future peace and security and yet left the Japanese some show of saving their military honor and some assurance of their national existence after they complied with all the safeguards necessary for the conqueror." That's the US and UK. The president countered by saying that he did not think the Japanese had any military honor after Pearl Harbor. Churchill, I contented myself with saying that at any rate, they had something for which they were ready to face certain death in very large numbers, and this might not be so important to us as to them. And he's talking there about the position of the emperor. So we can see that for some months now, and certainly in Potsdam, Churchill is arguing for the military position of having a Russian declaration of war and a promise to spare the emperor after the war. And he's putting these points even up to this moment where we're just on the edge of the final decisions about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So let's go through the timeline of what happens next. So on the 24th of July, Truman decides there's going to be an ultimatum to Japan, and it will still continue asking for unconditional surrender. It's not going to mention sparing the emperor, and it's not going to include a Russian declaration of war. Now, I'll just say in passing, there's a very interesting history of the declaration that gets made, but the first draft of it, written on the 2nd of July by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, has both of those elements in it. So on the 26th of July, the Potsdam Declaration is broadcast to the world, including the Japanese. And that is the final ultimatum. The first draft of the Potsdam Declaration, drawn up by the US Secretary of War, has a Soviet declaration of war and a promise that the emperor can continue after the war in a constitutional monarchy in it. But those elements are removed from the draft, from the text, by James Burns, who's Truman's special advisor. He's the Secretary of State, and Truman goes with his advice as opposed to the advice of pretty much everyone else in his administration and in the military. So the declaration broadcasts saying you must surrender. Japan doesn't surrender. So the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima with the results that we all know about. This takes the Soviet Union by huge surprise. They were very shocked that the Potsdam Declaration was broadcast without them being a signatory. And they protested when they saw the text and saying, you know, we should be in on this. And the US said, it's already being broadcast. They sent the text to them sort of pretty much as the broadcast was being made. What was most shocking for the Soviets was that at Potsdam, at the conference, Stalin and Truman had agreed between them that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan on the 15th of August. And in his private diary, Truman wrote, well, he wrote to his wife, I've got what I came for, which is, you know, Russia is going to declare war on Japan, because at that point, they still don't know whether the bomb would work. And he said, you know, I've got what I came for. And in his diary, he wrote, you know, Russians will come into the war on the 15th of August. Fini Japs when that happens. So it was a huge shock that this bomb was dropped before the 15th of August to the Soviets. So they declared war on Japan, kind of pretty much as fast as they could get their act together. And in fact, their military forces crossed the border into Japanese-held territory the next day. And the next day is also the day that the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Japan still doesn't surrender unconditionally. So after some days, Japan broadcasts its surrender, in which it is said that they have preserved the position of the emperor. They have preserved the imperial throne. Now, in fact, they have not negotiated that with the United States at all. They have just said, we are surrendering and we have secured the position of the emperor. And later that day, Truman accepts that the emperor will stay on the throne. So there had been so many officials within the US administration who had been saying, including military officials, we should declare war, we should get Russia to declare war on Japan, and we should offer to spare the emperor and see if that produces a surrender. And there were people, including Stimson, who were arguing we need to do that before we drop the atomic bomb. And instead, the sequence that Truman chose was, we drop the atomic bomb before the Soviet Union's going to declare war, then they do declare war, and then we drop it again, and then we accept that we will spare the emperor. So that picture of Hirohito that we saw earlier was extracted from this official photograph of the first time that Hirohito met General MacArthur, who became the ruler of Japan after the Second War under the US occupation. And this is them meeting at the US Embassy on the 17th of September. So Hirohito went on to continue on the throne until 1989. He almost saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. So he was never held to account for the crimes that were committed under his authority. And there was never any principled objection to promising to spare the emperor. That card was not played, but it wasn't because they were determined to put him on trial. And we can see from what happened. So Winston Churchill believed that there were two cards which either of them had a good chance of gaining a Japanese surrender, but played together, he thought there was a very good chance. And we've reviewed some of the documentary evidence for that. So this is where we started. Even Churchill thought Hiroshima was unnecessary. However, there is a complication about that, because after he heard about the Trinity nuclear test, Churchill's attitude to what should happen next changed dramatically. It wasn't actually when he was first told about the atomic bomb. It was when the detailed descriptions invoking divine imagery and a very poetic description of the devastation that was caused at the Trinity test. After he read that, Churchill's attitudes changed dramatically. So one of the people, there are several people who he talked to afterwards, but one of the people was Sir Alan Brooke, the head of the British military forces, who we mentioned earlier. And Brooke wrote in his diary what Churchill said to him on the 23rd of July, after Churchill had read through this very dramatic description of what the atomic bomb could do. So this is what Brooke wrote down as Churchill saying, now, this is just a part of what Brooke wrote. Now we had a new value which redressed our position. Pushing his chin out and scowling is what Brooke wrote. Now we had a new value which redressed our position, pushing his chin out and scowling. Now we could say, if you insist on doing this or that, well, we can just blot out Moscow, then Stalingrad, then Kiev, then Kuybyshev, Kharkov, Stalingrad, mentions again, Sebastopol, etc., etc. And now where are the Russians? So Churchill thought Hiroshima was unnecessary to defeat Japan, but he thought that atomic bombings were necessary to dominate and dictate to the Soviet Union. And so the historian who really brings all of this out, Kevin Moran, who's wrote Churchill and the Bomb in War and Cold War, he describes this day really as Churchill's transition from being an atomic bomb maker, because obviously Britain was involved in the research and so on that led to the making of the bomb, from atomic bomb maker to atomic diplomatist, i.e. someone who carries out atomic diplomacy. I think it would be just as fair to describe Churchill's attitudes as expressed there as those of a nuclear terrorist, as much as a nuclear atomic diplomatist, or if not a terrorist, at the very least, a nuclear bully. So Churchill very clearly thought that there were non-atomic ways of getting a Japanese surrender to end the Second World War in the Pacific. However, he became an enthusiastic proponent of dropping the atomic bomb before trying those other cards. So he fell in with Truman's plan, with Burns' plan. And that is why I think it's accurate to say Churchill thought Hiroshima was unnecessary to end the war. But it's also true to say that Churchill thought it was necessary to drop the atomic bomb for the power politics that he wanted the US and Britain to engage in from that point onwards.